guess what? I'm having a party, and you're invited.
It's weird to be in this situation having a documentary made because I'm used to having control of my alter ego. I wanted to be a performance artist. I could show you my characters. Out of nowhere, Pee Wee Herman popped out of me. The audience ate it up and went crazy.
When I first saw Paul as Pee Wee, I was like, who is this little man in this bow tie, and why is he throwing Tootsie Rolls at people?
Hollywood had taken notice. I mean, how could they not?
I remember thinking, this is going to be really big.
There wasn't like a moment in the 80s that wasn't super cool to be me. And then dark music. Bum, 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 bum. I lost control of my anonymity, and it was devastating. I don't want to come off like a victim in some way. I kept who I was a secret for a really long time. I hid behind an alter ego.
Today's secret word is fun.
I want kids to learn, not only is being different okay, let's celebrate it, but I want that not just for you, but for myself. Death is just so final. To be able to get your message in at the last minute is incredible.
He was so private, it was challenging for him to do the documentary, but he took a leap of faith. He wanted people to see who he was as Paul.
I'm flying!
All these different emotions, all these different influences and factors. I was like a good vessel for it all. I'm gonna leave out the part where we did enormous amounts of drugs. I didn't.
Hi, I'm Chuck Braverman. This is another episode of Westdoc Online. Today, which is kind of unusual, we're going back to a filmmaker that we interviewed 5.5 years ago on episode number 48. I hope he remembers. It's Matt Wolf, who produced a terrific film called Recorder about Marion Stokes, who recorded everything on television for 29 or 30 years. That's all. On I don't know how many VHS machines. But let's say hi to Matt. Hi, Matt. How are you?
Hi, Chuck. And of course I remember 5 years ago.
Oh, good. And funny, I was looking at the date, and I don't think we even mentioned the pandemic, which was probably in the first week or two of the pandemic at that time.
No, that film came out, I think, in 2019. So
our interview was in March of 2020.
Oh, so it was just percolating. God, crazy.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a blur.
I ask always, and I'm going to take a guess where you are, but where are you? What city are you in?
I'm in New York City in my office in the West Village right now.
What a nice place to be.
I know. I've got a cool little setup over here.
I love New York, and I love coming into town. I used to come in way more often, and I hopefully will be in town soon. So your latest film, which is getting a lot of press, and I understand won the Gotham TV Awards show last night. Congratulations to you.
Thank you so much.
And I'm sure that's just the beginning of the awards to come for this film. It's called Pee Wee as Himself. Is that the title? Pee Wee as Himself, right. How did you get involved in doing a film about Pee Wee Herman?
Well, Paul Reubens was always my dream subject. I had tried to approach him several times unsuccessfully. And then there was a rumor in trade publications that the Safdie brothers were working with him. And they were old friends, so I approached Josh in particular and asked if it was true. It was not true that they were working together, but I told him, I'd love to connect with him if you ever do. So kind of fortuitously, the producer, Emma Tillinger Koskoff, was in talks with Paul about helping him to make a documentary, and she suggested connecting with the Safdies, and they kind of match made us all. So from there, I started talking to Paul, for dozens of hours. It was during the peak of the pandemic. There was plenty of time. And I was trying to convince him that I was the one to tell his story, because he had met with a number of directors but was not interested in working with them because they were not open to the level of involvement that he wished to have.
So when you have somebody like the Safdie brothers on as executive producers, how involved are they or not in the making of the film?
You know, they gave me a lot of creative latitude and freedom. So I really was kind of, well, when working with Paul, very much in the kind of trenches dealing with him and trying to manage his desire for control and my desire to have control over my film. And so, you know, there was a power struggle that was happening that was so overwhelming with Paul that they kind of let me do my thing. But after Paul passed away and I started to edit the film, I think people were pretty sensitive to the fact that I had really struggled to make this film, that it was pretty unlikely that this film would even come to fruition. So luckily they and everybody else involved in the film, including HBO, just gave me a tremendous amount of creative freedom.
How and when did HBO get involved in this? From the beginning or in the middle or what?
Yeah, right at the beginning, HBO was very enthusiastic and came on board as our partners, and they sent us off and running.
So they basically were the financier of the film from the get-go?
Yeah, they fully financed the film.
So in your notes and within the context of the film, Paul is always trying to control the film. But one of the things that startled me reading a little bit about the making of this film was that you didn't seem to have the proper release signed by him until when?
Well, Chuck, it was a complex process. We had some form of an agreement, but not a fully finalized long-form agreement. And we were kind of flying by the seats of our pants in good faith. And then that power struggle between Paul and I hit ahead. We reached an impasse. And at that point, it was necessary to complete a deal and an agreement with Paul about the terms of using his archival footage and his life story. And it became a very difficult process that went on for over a year.
And were you getting phone calls from executives at HBO saying, when are we going to have the release? Or we have to have the release? Or
they were incredibly supportive. They understood the complexity of the situation and the complexity of Paul. And they were supportive of us trying to do anything we could to make this come together, to make it work.
Well, I must say it really does work. You've created an entertaining two-part series. I've watched the whole thing. I started to rewatch it again yesterday, and it's enjoyable to watch, but it's painful at the same time knowing that he's sort of deceiving everybody by not telling you that he's dying of cancer, and you certainly can't tell.
Well, I wouldn't see it as deception. I think it was a choice, and I respect that choice. I don't understand it, and I've never been in that situation, but certainly if he was transparent about his health, it would have changed the tenor of our conversation and our relationship. And that's the choice that he made. And the significance of some of the things he said shifted after he passed away. So, you know, I can't speak for Paul as to what he wanted in regards to his privacy with his health, but I had to grapple with that when editing the film.
One of the things I read in either the press notes or in a story that came out that you like, and I think you've said it, that you have lots of conversations with a subject, in this case, of course, Paul, before you do the filming. And my first thought was, as a filmmaker myself, I don't like having conversations too much with people before the filming, because all the good stuff sometimes kind of comes out before you turn the camera on. And I wonder if you
don't feel that way. I feel that a comprehensive pre-interview, or in this case, an epic kind of process of pre-interviewing, is pretty informative, and that people forget what they say in the context of those early conversations, and real things can unfold in an electric way on camera. I think the likelihood of somebody feeling at ease in front of cameras while telling their story is low. Most people are not comfortable doing that. And those that are overly kind of rehearsed in a certain way and are overly familiar with that process. So it's either one or the other for the most part. And I think a pre-interview is an opportunity to build a rapport. And I think with Paul, the trust issues were so immense that we really had to, we had to navigate that in a pretty significant way.
Do you think here's a strange question. I mean, do you think there's any comparison of Paul to somebody like Andy Kaufman, whose childhood television shows loves were the same as Paul? I mean,
yeah, I mean, I think that what is common about Andy Kaufman and Paul is that they were working in the space of comedy when it was still a somewhat experimental space. It wasn't just kind of the kind of primary mode of entertainment in our culture. Comedy was becoming a different sort of thing in the late 1970s, and Paul was in the mix on that. Andy Kaufman a little earlier than Paul, but that they both were finding ways to be experimental within a space that was still being pioneered.
I feel like I have a couple of actually special connections in a strange, odd way. When I was a child, my dad was a producer at NBC, and I can remember going to the Pinky Lee show.
Yeah, very cool. Audience. That's very cool. Pinky Lee. Do that. Pinky Lee was definitely an inspiration for Paul.
Hello, it's me. My name is Pinky Lee. And an image that sticks in my head forever was he was rehearsing and dancing around, and his toupee came flying off of his head.
Amazing.
And another connection, I was friends with Michael Fuchs, who used to run HBO in the very, very early days, and I assume it was from him I got an invitation to go to the Roxy for a special new something which I didn't know anything about what it was going to be, and it turned out to be Pee Wee Herman at the Roxy.
The Roxy show. That's very cool.
So I saw the Roxy opening, the opening night, and the Roxy. I had an office a block away from the Roxy.
Wow,
so
very cool.
It was easy, yeah. And I can remember going and seeing him and remembering that it was not an immediate acceptance, thinking there was a lot of funny bits, but I think it was something so different and so new and so juxtaposed at the Roxy, which was the hip place for cutting edge, rock and roll. And here was Pee Wee Herman at the Roxy, sort of doing what he ended up doing. What is your process when you had so many hours of footage, archive footage, and so many hours of interviews? How do you start to organize that?
Well, it's a collaborative process, particularly with the archive. There was a team led by Britton Dunham who was, logging and really organizing that material and also feeding it to me before I interviewed Paul. I have a pretty rigorous prep process where I really have a sense of what kind of story I want to cover. Of course, unexpected things come up, and with this, beyond unexpected things came up through that interview process because it was so epic and expansive. But, I already have a sense of the story I'm telling, and I have an awareness of the underlying material that can be used to tell that. So I think with this film, there obviously was the sort of biographical dimension of who Paul was and the work that he made. And, that whole chronological narrative was something I always intended to tell that way. But what came about in the interview was this sort of rebellious streak, Paul pushing and pulling with me and kind of resisting, being an interview subject. And that play between us became something we wanted to experiment with. So our editor, Damian Rodriguez, would pull out that material, which I'd look at, and we'd flag things that were particularly interesting. I mined transcripts to recall really significant things that occurred during the interview. And in addition to that, we had many secondary interviews that we wanted for contrasting perspective or to fill in blanks that Paul couldn't fill in himself. And so, it's a team effort to sort of mine such a huge corpus of material, but it's a process that I love to do, but it's best informed when there's intentions from the onset.
And one of the things you've said about making a biodoc is that you like to write a love story more or less to the person. Is that accurate?
No, not really. I think my initial appeal to somebody as a subject is what I call a love letter. And, I think it's I come to films with a lot of affection and curiosity about my subjects. I don't come to subjects who I feel innately skeptical of. That's not my standpoint. And so I come to them with that and want to be transparent, but also to express curiosity to understand why they might want to tell a story. So there's a flirtation involved in the process of bringing somebody on board to agree to be the subject of a film or to grant access to the story or legacy or estate of somebody who's no longer around. So the love letter is part of my process, but there is a certain affectionate intention that kind of goes in a variety of directions, and some people are not receptive to that outreach.
The producer that you have had on board, Emma Tillinger Koskoff, is quite a impressive list of being Oscar nominee on several films and working with Martin Scorsese on a bunch of films. How did you come up with having somebody like that who's coming from the feature world, which sounds terrific and very helpful?
Well, Emma met Paul when he had a role on Blow. Emma at the time was Ted Demme's assistant, and in the interim period, she got involved with Martin Scorsese and ended up producing a number of his films and had actually just left that office and that collaboration when Paul approached her. Paul was an admirer of her work. They were kind of old friends from that experience on the film Blow. And he wanted her advice and support in terms of making a documentary. And she connected him to the Safdies, who I had expressed this interest to. And then Emma initially was going to be just an executive producer on the film, even though she kind of was the matchmaker. But she became available to actually produce the film and is an incredible, resourceful producer. But primarily, she was acting as a mediator between Paul and I. She was the person who was Paul's confidant, but she also is a very director-driven producer who was trying to support me to accomplish my artistic goals. And she was able to, play both sides in an authentic and real way that helped Paul and I see eye to eye for a while until things broke down.
What do you think it was about you that Paul chose you over whatever long or short list of other directors that he spoke to about this project?
Well, initially he was very skeptical. He didn't like my film Spaceship Earth, which had just come out. But then through Josh's insistence, he watched my first film, Wild Combination, as well as my film Recorder. And I think he responded to the dreaminess of those films. I think he really connected to Arthur Russell as a subject. I also don't think it hurt that I was gay. Paul wanted to come out in the documentary, but was very uncomfortable with that. And so, we had to do a dance around that, but I think he felt a little safer navigating that with somebody who was gay, but it was a source of affinity and it was also a source of tension because, I think we come from different generations. I grew up and came out when I was 14 years old and was in the media as a gay teen activist, and my identity as a gay person is central to who I am, and I have no issues with that. That was, as you know in the film, not the case for Paul. So I think Paul and I had a lot in common, sensibility-wise and to some extent personality-wise, and then we had a lot of strong differences. So I think he felt a connection to me, and I felt it back.
Are you Jewish?
I am Jewish. I think the fact that Paul and I were both gay and Jewish and grew up with families that were similarly supportive of our artistic ambitions and very proud of us was a point of connection.
It's funny because just looking again this morning, and I was looking at the clips of Paul with his parents, the 8mm films, he looked like he had wonderful, terrific, supportive, warm, caring parents just by looking at the video,
Yeah, I think he was incredibly close with his family, and that family was important to him. I also think there was complexity to his relationship with his father, who was, typical of his generation and a larger-than-life kind of macho personality, and Paul was a little more, artistic and sensitive. And I think his father was supportive, but that Paul was preoccupied with his approval, and that there were two sides to Paul, the Spanky and Alfalfa sides, as he says, from the Little Rascals, this kind of entrepreneurial, street smart guy, and also the sensitive artist, and that those two things gelled together in terms of his success, and that he got the kind of street smart side from his father, and I think definitely was looking for his approval throughout his life.
Just as a side note, you mentioned Little Rascals, and I noticed that it was colorized. And was that something that you did, or just a clip that you happened to find?
It was an episode that was in color, that we sourced.
But I assume it was not shot in color, because it looked like it was colorized.
I assume not. I'm not sure about the kind of provenance of that.
I was a big fan. I grew up with the Little Rascals on TV. I've probably seen every episode of the Little Rascals. Too.
I love it.
You mentioned that part of what you had in common with Paul was being gay, but there's a line that says he didn't want the film to be shot through a queer lens. So do you think, I don't know, what does that mean or not mean?
Well, Paul didn't want to be depicted as a gay icon, and while he wanted to come out in the film, I think he imagined or wished that to be a small side note. He didn't want me to kind of subject my queer lens all over the film because it was from his point of view and his story, and he was concerned that my take would overly focus on that. I think he understood that my entry point and desire to make the film was not because of the controversies of his arrest. That was actually the least interesting component for me. And that was a point of concern for him. And it was something I was interested in exploring, not as an identity-based thing, so much so as the fact that Paul chose to go into the closet. I felt that had a significant and long-term impact over his life, particularly his decision to separate himself from his alter ego. In a way, he hid the kind of Paul of it all. And I associate that with being closeted and protecting his anonymity so that he could live his life as a gay man without compromising his professional opportunities.
When you were editing the film and after Paul died and you came across the line of him looking at camera and saying death is so final and getting something about getting your message across, I mean, was that, did you remember that right out of the box when you heard that he died, or did you come across it and were sort of shocked looking at it?
It was shocking. I mean, the day after Paul died, I started to read the 1,500-page transcript of my 40-hour interview with him, and I pored over it day and night. And within that interview, there was all sorts of stuff that felt like it was more significant in the context of Paul's death. And that line in particular was pretty uncanny, a little chilling. I don't know his intention when he said that, but I do know that it felt very meaningful after his death.
Is there anything you would do different if you were approaching this film again from the start? Now, from your perspective of being done with it?
Well, now that I've made this film, which is so much about issues of control, I think anybody who would go into a film with me would understand my insistence on maintaining control over my own work, but also my empathy for my subjects. And if I were to meet a subject like Paul who wanted to tell their story with complexity and nuance, I would be able to express to them that I need to maintain my editorial independence in a way that I think they would have a different kind of context for it. Sort of like, if you want to work with me, this is what it looks like. And this was the situation I was in with Paul. And if you respond to that film, you may understand why it was necessary for me to be able to do what I do. And so those conversations are sort of like, trust me. They're big leaps of faith. They're big requests from people. But I think when you've made a work like this film, it contextualizes that differently. And I don't think I would go into a film without somebody pretty clearly expressing their intention to let me make the film independently.
Would you go as far down the line, you think, with another famous subject who was hesitant to sign the release until the last moment? Or
no.
Have you kind of...
no, I wouldn't. In some ways, I don't have regrets, because what's the point of that? And the film came out well and has been well received, but it was a horrible experience to be in conflict with Paul and to not know if the film would come to fruition. And I hope to never be in a situation like that again.
What are you doing next?
Next, I am working on a film about the world of soap operas, and I'm behind the scenes at The Bold and the Beautiful at Television City in Hollywood. And the show, which most people don't know, was created by a soap opera family dynasty that was helmed by William J. Bell, who created The Young and the Restless and The Bold and the Beautiful. And today his son runs The Bold and the Beautiful, and it's a film that will really show the workplace follies of how the sausage is made to bring these shows to life. And that will look into the history of that family legacy and hopefully reappraise the cultural significance of soaps.
I've been on the set a couple of times of a couple of soaps, as a director, just observing what's going on. And I thought it was the craziest, most difficult, most insane thing I'd ever seen in my life compared to, episodic television, say, where you can, you sit down, you're going to do a page or two at a time, and you could take hours doing it. Whereas the soaps, they're doing an hour every day.
Yeah.
Which is,
it's
wild.
I don't even... It's a wild, surreal process. It's been really fun to observe it, and I'm excited about that film.
What a great project. And
thank you.
Is it too early to ask? Is there a streamer or a network involved?
Too early to ask.
Well, thank you for sitting down with me on this film project, which feels like it's going to last for a very, very long time, because you picked the right subject and you did a fabulous job. Congratulations.
Thank you, Chuck. I appreciate it.